everybody, and also thanks to the University of Sheffield and the Centre for Freedom of the Media, the Hub for the Study of Hybrid Communication, and the Migration Research Group for actually facilitating that space. I'm always really happy to speak about exile journalism, which thankfully starts getting or gaining a little more attention in the academic and in the international landscapes. I'm Louisa. I have been studying exile journalism since 2018, really, and I'm currently doing my PhD at the University College Cork in Ireland, where I am working on an independent conceptualization of the phenomenon of exile journalism, of contemporary exile journalism, I should say. And I'm funded and supported by Cosanuswerk, so thank you for that as well. And I'm gonna basically tell you today about my entire PhD project as of where it is right now. I'm gonna quickly give you the context of exile journalism in the world, but also in the academic world. And then I introduce my project and speak about the challenges that I have identified of exile journalism, but also of studying exile journalism. And then I will share my first attempt of a conceptualization. I'm finally there. So next slide, please. I will quickly go over this because everybody that is here knows that exile journalism has become a global phenomenon. It's this is the first global map of migratory flows of journalists worldwide that was published by Reporters Without Borders last year. There are a couple of omissions and stuff. It's just very much a work in progress, just like my project of also international organizations finally catching up on the phenomenon being like really a global issue and starting to better document things. And I'm really happy to also have Jessica White here, who is going to tell us more about this as well from an organizational side. Next slide, please. In academia, exile journalism has been largely understudied when I started my PhD project. Things are changing now, and I'm really delighted to see really an array of case studies emerging from different geographical regions. But, and this is also where my PhD kind of starts. As I said, most of the things that we have seen so far produced in academia are case studies, singular case studies, and it's really hard to generalize from these because context is everything, as hopefully eventually everybody in academia will acknowledge. But at the same time, there are global exile journalism or exile journalism around the world has become really a trend, and you can see those trends across case studies, and this is what I'm trying to do. The other starting point of my PhD was that I have observed that exile journalism and the practices of exile journalists have often been described as hybrid. And while this definitely in the very understanding of the term applies to specific practices of exile journalists, I personally believe that by defining everything that is not fitting into neat categories of Western-dominated journalistic frames as a hybrid form of everything, we are kind of really losing the essence of what is actually happening. And another dominant factor in existing studies of exile journalism are exile journalists' relationships to activism or advocacy, and of course the focus on precarity. All of those will also, of course, evidently surface in my studies, but I'm trying to focus a bit more on the conceptualization side for this event that is also titled Conceptualization of Exile Journalism. Next slide. I basically already said most of those things. There is 4 main areas that are all going to be, I hope that I'm kind of trying to combine in my concept that I'm going to present. Because so far exile journalism, there is a big dominance on or a big focus on digital social networks and journalists' interaction with digital social networks, which is definitely a big part of exile journalism in large parts of the world. But I argue that there is an overemphasis on digital social networks and exile journalism, especially in cases where exile journalists actually hail, like from countries where exile journalists actually hail from. there is a lot of times very restricted or no access to the internet. So I believe we should not lose the focus on traditional radio journalism produced in exile either. The other things I have already mentioned that which are dominant in existing case studies and will also surface in mine. Next slide, please. This is a quote by one of the journalists that I work with. I prefer saying work with rather than work on, because my project is very much standing on the shoulders and only exists thanks to exiled journalists who share their stories with me. So that's just a little disclaimer. This quote says, "It is very important to think of a theorization of exile journalism, because what we have lived at ours follows us. There are norms that we can't follow." And further down, my colleague continues saying, "Finally, another form of journalism that is done not uniquely in the big buildings with the big men and women in impeccable clothes, but by people like us," he said, "who register a program in the toilets." This is just, it sounds weird out of context, but in that very context, the toilets of the building that they got to record radio programs were the best soundproofed rooms. So they would record their exile radio programs from toilets. Next slide. Yeah, this is to say, now down there you can see it was supposed to just then come up, and the objective based on this statement also and my observations is to now develop an independent conceptualization of this other form of journalism without constantly comparing it to already existing forms of journalism, and I do so through qualitative research and grounded theory. Next slide. These are my case studies. That's also where the quotes are going to come from that I'm going to run through today. I work with East African exile journalists from Eritrea and Burundi. The Eritreans that I interviewed are mostly based in France, the Burundians mostly based in Belgium, and then I also work with Latin American exiled journalists from Venezuela, mostly based in Colombia and the US, and then from Nicaragua, based in Costa Rica. Next slide. There's a lot of text on the following slides, which are quotes from my research, and I apologize, there's a big, those are quotes now from the East African cases, because I have not yet finished the coding of my Latin American cases, but I have a good overview, and I can say that it basically is the same, just in different quotes. So that's just to explain why there's a big East African focus in this presentation. The challenges of exile journalism, as we are all well aware of, and that are not really difficult to understand even for people who don't study journalism, is that journalism should be based on being there and observing and gathering and verifying information, and all of this kind of falls apart once you go into exile, because you don't have access to the field anymore. You cannot witness yourself anymore, so you rely on secondary information networks, and the verification process just becomes extremely difficult and long, and there is a big focus on actually needing to trust those sources. Next slide. The organizational structures are challenges that are basically at the very basis of exile journalism, and if it functions or not. And I don't believe they have been given enough consideration yet in the academic field, because they really are the basis of journalism, of working as a journalist. And once you go into exile as a journalist, especially in cases like Eritrea or Burundi, you would not be able to flee with your entire newsroom, like, for example, the Nicaraguans did with Confidencial into Costa Rica, but you flee as an individual journalist in an urgency, in an emergency. And once you're abroad, you have to kind of regroup with whatever colleague is also there. And I work with a lot of exile media that are newly founded in exile. And then on top of being a journalist, you suddenly become an editor, which is still quite related. So that's fair enough. But then you're also, you're supposed to be then also a technician, a publisher, a manager. You have to suddenly do everything, even though you left in quotation marks only as a journalist, right? So this is really one of the biggest problems. Okay, next slide. Funding and sustainability, I'm not going to go into that because we are all aware of that. There's no structural funding available to exile journalists. Next one. Safety is very self-speakingly as well. Next one, please. I'm sorry. The trust, yes, I will go into this when there's questions about those different topics that I'm just throwing out now, because I really want to get to the concept in those last 5 minutes. Next slide, please. It's all a question about good journalism, and I believe this also reflects in the studies and in the organizational struggles of the international organizations to actually support exile journalists in different cases, because a lot of times their quality of journalism is questioned, which is next slide, based on their supposed relationship to activism and difficulties in defining what their work actually wants to achieve. Next slide. And the next one. This is just, I'm going to just really quick, without mentioning the quotes, say also that I believe one of the biggest problems in the conceptualization and in the study of exile journalism today is that a lot of times we do not work with the specific term of exile, and there seem to be interchangeable terms of diaspora and refugee journalism, and those are different things. So I have a big focus on that as well, and work with the definitions that the exile journalists themselves give me. Next slide. We skipped that one, 3 slides down. Yes, there we go. So now I quickly come to the first draft of my concept, where I basically tackle, we basically work with this understanding of exile journalism, of journalism that you currently see on the screen, where journalism would be a lot of times described as an occupational ideology. Now, of course, there has been a lot of involvement in journalism studies. I don't want to diminish this, and there is much more flexibility in cultural awareness and contextual awareness now in journalism studies, but still those like gut terms and those very cemented principles of how journalism should be done remain in a general understanding of journalism. And this stands in opposition or in contrast to a lot of the experiences that are forced onto journalists who have to go into exile. Next slide, please. So based on this, I am really like in my conceptualization of exile journalism, I'm not centering journalism, I'm centering exile, because exile, as also Edward Said said, undermines everything. Any achievement that you have in exile, such as producing journalism, is characterized by the condition of exile. So in my concept, I argue to move away from this urgency and emergency focus that then a lot of times leads to a hybrid understanding of some form of journalism that exile journalists do, towards a permanent understanding of both exile and the journalism produced in exile. I say this because also this has very practical implications. A journalist from Nicaragua who was in Costa Rica told me that a lot of funders, for example, don't understand that they cannot apply and do not want to apply to emergency funding anymore, because exile has become a permanent condition for them. And there is a lot of conceptual misunderstandings there. And I am currently developing exile journalism as a concept of an existential ideology as opposed to an occupational ideology, because it is really about survival. And that sounds drastic, but the quotes and the experiences the journalists share with me support this, or basically it's based on this. So first, it's about survival of a person. You go into exile because you have to survive. So one journalist told me a good journalist is a living one. I don't ask me why you ask me about all of those norms and motivations. Then you have to survive. Once you are in exile, you have to survive as a journalist in an environment where there's very, very little professional opportunities for you or structural support for your exile media. The survival of the information is crucial to exile journalism, because the information that your sources in Eritrea have has to reach you somehow, which is very dangerous also for the sources back in Eritrea. And only as one part of it, my concept focuses on the journalistic practices, really, because somehow they also have to survive the verification and the transparency. And every journalist, exile journalist that I spoke to is very focused on being highly professional. So still defense of the profession, but only as one aspect. I'm closing on the last word of the survival of journalism in general. And it's unfortunately a kind of pessimistic and somber last word and outlook of exile journalism, because one journalist told me what concerns him most is that they are the last generation. Once they retire or stop producing journalism, for example, in that case, the Nicaraguans, there is no other Nicaraguan journalists following, because the Nicaraguan government has shut everything down in regards to free speech. And this is very concerning. And this is, again, supporting my claim that we should focus more on the permanence of the condition.